recording.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this event for the Alwaleed Center for American Studies and Research here at the American University in Cairo. The CASAR was established in 2003 by Prince Alwaleed to build cultural understanding between parts of the Middle East and parts of the West. And so, in addition to AUC and AUB in Beirut that are part of this network, the network also consists of Cambridge and Edinburgh in the UK, and then Georgetown and Harvard in America. Anyway, welcome. It's my pleasure to welcome you here. Thanks, first of all, to the Alwaleed Foundation. Thanks also to my assistant, Yasmina Ghazali, who really makes this whole thing work. Thanks to all of you for coming. Today it's my pleasure and my privilege to welcome James David Spellman to AUC. Today's lecture will explore the behavioral dynamics of financial markets, from explanations about how our thinking process works to patterns of behavior that investors exhibit in managing their portfolios. From that foundation, our guest today will explore the dangers of political messaging when failing to understand behavioral economics using examples from the United States. So James David Spellman is the principal of Strategic Communications, LLC, a public affairs firm based in Washington, D.C., specializing in meeting the complex research and analytical needs of financial concerns for legislation and regulatory policies. He has worked on Capitol Hill for 3 senior members of Congress, including the man who eventually became President, Joseph R. Biden. And at George Washington University, he teaches media training for senior Pentagon officials. He writes about financial issues for South China Morning Post, Nikkei, and other publications. He also provides commentary on international economics for Sharp News, an Arabic language Saudi television channel, and news portal in partnership with Bloomberg News. Mr. Spellman holds an MPhil in International Relations from Oxford University. Please join me in welcoming James Spellman to the podium at AUC.
Well, thank you, Mark. Thank you, and thank the Center for American Studies and Research for having me here today, and thank all of you for coming. And a shout out to Shireen Darwish and her husband, Mohammed Josh. They've been wonderful hosts, and we've been good friends for a long time, and she has a wonderful laughter, and she also is incredibly inspiring as her husband is, so thank you both. Today we're going to walk through a very complicated landscape in terms of politics and markets. And those two always don't work together well, partly because politicians don't necessarily understand markets, and markets really don't understand Washington or global politics. So we'll be looking at all of that, and to do that, just get the thing to move forward here. Here we go. Oops, I think we've got a little clicker issue. But to do that, we're going to step back and look at a field called behavioral economics, which is a growing field in terms of having us better understand how human beings work from an economic standpoint, how we make decisions, and with the thesis that, which one did you say? Oh yeah, go to the next one. This guy is, I can use the cursors. Okay. So a lot to cover in a short amount of time, so we're just going to hit the highlights. But I thought it'd be interesting for you to see 2 examples of where the markets have reacted adversely to what Trump has said. And the most recent ones, obviously, are Liberation Day and Greenland. I also was going to talk about oil prices and talks with Iran, but that one's another lecture at minimum. And then from that, we're going to step back, and we're going to look at behavioral economics. And here we'll look at particularly the work of Joseph Kahneman and Amos Tversky. And they wrote Spellman wrote a brilliant book called Thinking Fast and Slow. And we'll look at those cognitive processes. And then from there, we're going to look at, well, what does that mean in terms of how our minds think? And they and other researchers have discovered these mental shortcuts that we have called heuristics. And we'll do a quick survey of those. And one of those, for example, is loss aversion. It's that time when, you know, you keep losing money on an investment or losing money on a car that you bought that you thought was better than it turned out to be, but yet you don't want to get rid of your losses. You hate to face a loss, to suffer a loss. So what do? You keep the loss going and going and going. And that's a very big part of behavioral economics in terms of how people think. And we see that over and over again in terms of investors and markets. And then from there, we're going to talk about communications. And there's an excellent book, Frank Luntz, It's Not What You Say, It's What People Hear That Matters. Again, it's not what you say, it's what people hear that matters. His point is that we may spend hours, days working on carefully crafting our scripts and our PowerPoints, but we don't necessarily understand what you, as the audience, understand, what kinds of words you use. And so there's a disconnect. So what he advises is very simple. Find out how people use the words that you want to use. And we'll talk about how he worked his magic in terms of passing a major piece of legislation. And then we're going to step back and then talk about power of narratives. And Robert Schuller, Nobel economist at Yale, wrote a very famous book about narrative economics. And there what he does is he looks at how narrative storytelling create dynamics for how markets work. So in other words, numbers don't make decisions, stories do. And we'll talk about what? We'll talk about how that narrative economic situation works. And then we're going to kind of pull it all together. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to go around and ask each of you for a quick takeaway to tell me how you quickly synopsize what we discussed in a brief few seconds, as you know, as a way to stimulate some discussion in that regard. So let me stop there and see if everyone's in agreement, if that's a clear roadmap, and how we can move forward. All right, fantastic. Okay, so, hi, welcome. If we all remember, before the election, guess what President Trump was doing? Claiming credit for the markets and the performance. And these are just some of the various quotes that he had on Truth Social. I mean, he was constantly making this point, which is very simple that I'm the reason why the markets are doing well. And I'm also the reason why you shouldn't vote for my opponent, Joseph Biden, at that time. And I'm going to play a quick video, which will show you how that all is. There we go. It runs about a minute and a half, 2 minutes. You've probably seen this video. Hi, welcome. Yasmin has been invaluable throughout this whole process, getting things set up. So let's give it a quick shout out to her. But you see how in this communications, he uses capital letters, exclamation points. Let's see if we can toggle. Okay. Anyway, we'll come back to it. How's that? But does everyone remember all the rhetoric that he spoke about? All the rhetoric he gave to people about the markets and why he was the reason why they were doing well? Well, we see that again in Liberation Day. front page headlines here for Trump and tariffs. And the world changed overnight, right? He threatened huge tariffs, and what happened to the markets? They fell sharply. It was one of the largest falls in markets since COVID pandemic. And if we all remember COVID, oh, bravo. We'll just play about 2 minutes of this. I think 2 minutes is enough.
In itself is going very well. We're leading, I believe, in all 7 swing states. So I appreciate everybody's work, and the spirit is unbelievable. I don't think there's ever been anything like it in our country's history, frankly, because we want to see our country. And she's running on a campaign of demoralization and really a campaign of destruction. But really, perhaps more than anything else, it's a king. And we're stuck with it. Obliterated. We've never had a situation like this. Decimated the middle class, and runaway inflation has caused problems the likes of which we never thought possible. Bloodshed, squalor to our cities is common, and they've unleashed a war and chaos all over the world. No person has caused so much destruction and death at home and abroad should ever be allowed to be the President of the United States. You can't have that.
Okay, now we're going to move forward to Liberation Day and his promises about Liberation Day and how that's going to create a better economy for the world and make America strong.
Should I run the video?
Why don't we're going to move out of that video. And we're going to go into the next video that we had.
This one?
Yeah, this one. There we go. This is a news report.
It's tanking nearly
Should I run the video?
Yeah.
1,700 points in the wake of President Trump's tariffs announcement. Some leaders around the world vowing now to fight back.
The markets today are way down, the worst day in years because of the tariffs. So, how's it going?
I think it's going very well. We're up almost to $7 trillion of investment coming into our country. And you'll see how it's going to turn out. Our country's going to boom.
But to start, more than $2.7 trillion in stock market value wiped out.
This is all going to just lead to negotiation, which may go this way, may go that way.
Not according to the White House.
This is not a negotiation. This is a national emergency.
Key trading partners are already adjusting their policies, including Canada, Mexico.
In any case, we will accelerate many of the actions of the Mexico plan.
And the EU.
The global economy will massively suffer.
Democrats in D.C. warn that tariffs are inflationary without offering any alternative policies besides the status quo.
There are millions of Americans who voted for Donald Trump believing he would actually reduce prices. He is demonstrably raising prices on virtually everything.
There are signs the president's big picture plan could take shape with automobiles, and this news from GM that General Motors will be making operational adjustments at Fort Wayne Assembly, including hiring temporary employees to support current manufacturing and business needs. However, the scale of the tariffs and the sell-off were a shock during an earnings call led by the CEO of Restoration Hardware.
The stock went down, based on some of the numbers he reported, and then it got killed because of, oh, really? Okay. I just looked at the screen, I looked at it. It got hit when I think the tariff came out.
Certainly not the only expletive from an executive today. Tonight, aboard Air Force One, President Trump also confirmed that another pillar of his economic plan, DOGE, will continue even when Elon Musk leaves the White House after his status as a special government employee runs out.
And then we'll stop there. Well, let me stop at that, and I think we're all familiar with that. Any thoughts so far about the rhetoric that they used in terms of tariffs?
Can we just use the microphone because of the recording?
Any thoughts on how he used Liberation Day? But you can see the headlines, and you can see the devastation in terms of the global stocks tanking. And as a consequence, a year later, he promised that they would deliver jobs in manufacturing, but actually there are fewer jobs in manufacturing after all that. And when all is said and done, two-way trade between the U.S. and its key trading partners is pretty much the same. And ironically, China is having a whopping year in terms of its exports as a consequence. So he created a very muddy situation, but he always uses the same rhetoric in terms of framing how he would like the public, the world, to see his policies on liberation and tariff cuts. Now, framing is a common concept. I'm sure you're all familiar with it. But what framing means in short is it's how we use a word to see the world. Like, for example, if I said the word chair to you and asked you, what first comes to your mind when I say the word chair? What would come to your mind first? What would come to your mind first?
I'm sorry?
If I were to say the word chair to you, what image would come to your mind immediately?
Chair? Like the head?
Like the head of a company?
Yeah.
Okay, that's one thing. And what about you?
The object that was said.
An object that we sit on. And you nodded.
Yeah, I honestly, I just picture what's right in front of me, like an actual chair.
Well, this is a very simple example, but it demonstrates how all the words that we have in our head carry with them frames. And these frames are developed over time, through history, through the language that we use, the lens that we use to see the world, and critical in terms of why language is so important. And I think we have to give President Trump credit for his mastery at using very strong, concrete nouns to carry across his point. But at the same time, what we see is the rhetoric that he uses is very unsettling to Wall Street, because they immediately see doom and gloom around the corner, and high tariffs mean what for an economy? They mean trouble, right? Tension with trading partners. Trade is extremely important. We have a global economy which is interdependent. I'm sorry, get the question.
I was just going to say that it's interesting how its framing isn't really based in reality even. So it's framing, but it's just completely disconnected from the reality of, the impact of its policies, which I think is different to how politicians usually behave.
Well, over time, he's developed a lexicon that works with his population. Because who in that way is he appealing to? His political base, right? And then why is that important? Because his party is running for election 2 years later, which is this year. They're called midterm elections. And why is that important? Because the control of Congress is at stake. And if Congress goes to the Democrats, what will happen? You'll see an endless barrage of calls for impeachment of him, his family, questioning these business dealings. So for the next 2 years, he has many storms to play out. And so, in all effect, his administration is going to be frozen. And you'll also see that when the tide turns, when things fall apart, typically in a political movement, what happens? All of your followers run away, right? Because they don't want to follow a loser. They want to go with the winner. And so when they smell the tide turning, when they see the tide turning, they bail and they look for another party in that regard. And again, we've seen it with Greenland, right? What happened? Big threats about Greenland. We're going to control it. None of us in the States knew where this was coming from, because it was completely out of the blue with everything else going on. And as a consequence, stocks plummeted sharply. And what else happened? Our relations with NATO were suddenly poisoned yet again, and with Europe. And as a consequence, stocks looked at this and said trouble ahead, and stocks plummeted. But what rose in the markets? Gold, precious metals, rare earths, because those are a strategic source, and these areas are particularly important for obtaining rare earths. So we saw that happen, but guess what? Days before Davos, you start sending signals saying that, I don't necessarily think things are going that badly with Greenland, and we're going to take a pause. And so what happened in markets right after that? So I think those are some quick examples to show how we see rhetoric and markets go in that guard. And another consequence was defense stocks soared. We saw that. Okay, well, there's two academic studies. I won't bore you about them. They're in the speech and they're in the slides. But they basically say the same thing, right? They looked at, for example, political actions and political rhetoric and how they affected the prices of rare earths and precious metals. And there was a clear correlation. They also looked at maritime transport and how it affected maritime transport. And this is particularly interesting because what these researchers show is it's a symbiotic relationship. In other words, it's not simply one side when you pursue rhetoric, that often policies follow. And in this case, as they were making claims towards new types of transport routes for access to rare earths, what happened? It came after that defense policies had to change to bolster defense. So it's almost like a pinball machine, where you say something and it ricochets global reaction and it forces you to make policy changes. That pinball ricochets and ricochets, and that forces more rhetoric and then more policy changes. So what they're saying is that in this study, they're saying that one thing feeds off of another, policy actions and rhetoric. Well, I think we all knew that, but it's always good to, quickly show I'm not quite sure why this toggle thing isn't working here. Okay, so this is a very classic optical illusion. Has any of you seen this before?
Perception.
Yeah. And why this is important, because it will lead into my point about behavioral economics, to show that we have physiological dynamics in how we perceive the world, which shape our thinking, and hence shape how we interpret the world and how we respond. And so which line here is longer? Let's see, show of hands. Who thinks the vertical is longer? Who thinks the horizontal is longer? Okay. Who thinks, none of them, they're all the same. Okay, bravo. Well, I know it's a well-worn thing, but indeed they are. And then I'm going to show you one more, and then we'll talk a little bit about they do that. Which pink dot is bigger? It's a little bit more tricky.
The one on the right.
Okay, right. Right too. Anyone else? Left? Everyone thinks they're right. Why do you think that's the case?
Surrounded by smaller dots, make it bigger.
Because of context.
Because exactly both things. These smaller dots create context. And what's here? What's here? There's more white space, right? And what they found out in terms of perception physiology is that when you have a bigger, ill-defined exterior, the object within can perhaps appear larger. And so here, the white space between the black dots is smaller. So it enhances your view of that pink dot. Second of all, relativity. Here you have bigger dots, right? So immediately, this is smaller than that, right? So that frame helps you to look at this, where you see these are smaller dots, and maybe this is bigger, or this is smaller. So it's again, as Shireen just said, Dr. Shireen, the context really matters, and that's an important thing. There's scores and scores of examples of this, but optical illusions really do shape how we perceive the world. Now that all has led to this idea called prospect theory, and this is at the core of Daniel Kahneman's work, and I mentioned it earlier, thinking fast and slow. And what he found in his early studies is that we have two types of aversion or thinking processes, which he feels are somewhat hardwired. One is loss aversion, and the other is diminishing sensitivity. Have we heard of loss aversion before? Well, this is where if you receive 100 Egyptian pounds, in some way it will seem like more money than 1,000 Egyptian pounds. Now that seems incongruous, but when we look at the relativity of the amount of money versus a larger scale, that first plus is always received more positively. And then, as we get into diminishing sensitivity, I liken it to a cupcake. Your first cupcake is always the best one, right? The second cupcake you get to, and you've had the sugar hit, you've had the dopamine hit, and so it's not as powerful of a hit in that regard. So that was the foundation of years of inquiry for both of them and other scientists in terms of looking at what is it about the way that we think that makes us illogical. That this idea of Adam Smith, the Wealth Foundations, that we have a logical, calculated way to see the world, homo economicus, that dynamic, that model doesn't really work in terms of how we actually work in the real world. And he came up with a list of what he called heuristics, little shortcuts, and cognitive biases. And these are just a few. He spoke about loss aversion. And he writes that people just hate the idea of losing. That any loss, even a small one, is just terrible to contemplate. So there's an aversion. He also wrote about optimistic bias, that we tend to be always optimistic about ourselves. We think more highly of ourselves and our thoughts than we do about the general population. And that is self-deluding. And he believes that it's probably the most powerful cognitive process out there. And then, as I spoke earlier, that diminished sensitivity as the amount of increases. Let me stop there. Has anyone had those experiences or been aware of those experiences? You've nodded your head.
Come across bias. So it's interesting to I've come across these things because I work in copy editing, so I kind of have to look at how what you described, how context and perception can impact how we receive text, how we do it.
Okay, that's fantastic. So you work in the whole area of cognitive thinking and fantastic. Another point to get across, which is from another thinker, Malcolm Gladwell. How many of you are familiar with the book Blink? Good. Well, okay, well, you raised your hand. Explain to me what the takeaway is from.
I know of it, but I haven't read it.
Okay. Okay, I'm gonna. You raise your hand as well behind. Why don't you give us a quick takeaway in terms of.
I can't really remember the context of the book because I read it a really long time ago, but I'm guessing it was around the concept of the sort of being blindsided, I guess, to an extent, or no?
No, it's really about when you look at someone, you look at me or I look at you, it's amazing how the subconscious mind is pulling all kinds of detail about you. And more often than not, some scientists feel that first impression is the most important because it's the foundation. It's very durable. It's somewhat hard to change. Yes, sir.
This reminds me of, This reminds me of, stereotyping, because stereotyping is actually, however much we frown upon it, it is a survival mechanism, and as such, I think it's very difficult to bypass.
just conscious level.
No, that's actually, because you raised another point about, well, how did all this stuff come to be? And the survival dynamics way back when we were, cavemen or cavewomen or whatever. Apparently some of these dynamics go back there in terms of developing a cognitive process that made us much more aware of our surroundings and being quick to make decisions because our predators act very quickly. So some of the other mental shortcuts that we have are availability. How often have we been in a situation where we read an article about an airplane crash? And then what do we think about right after that? Or every time we go past an airport, think, oh, we had a crash, or what crash? That's one. Anchoring effect is another, and that's over time. We develop a way the world works. You can call it your swagger, your vibe, whatever. But it's just simply a way in which we need ideas and ways that we understand lessons that we've learned over time. Pulled away from Dr. Shireen's class, Mark's class, etc., to learn more. And so anchoring is an important reference point. And as Shireen mentioned earlier, representativeness. For example, you see a tall guy or a tall woman, and you assume that they probably are basketball players, or you see someone looks very studious with thick glasses, and you think, geez, maybe they work in the library in that regard. And all of this is all part of a dynamic in how we think that Kahneman points out. And I have some quotes on the side, because his work has so many layers. In fact, every sentence in that book is a gem. You could just pull out one sentence every day, and it opens doors and windows for you. Thinking fast and slow. But he says that, intuitive heuristics, that we don't like facing difficult questions. And we always move towards the easy question. How many times have we done that in exams, for example? Like the exam question, the professor asks one question, and what do? We give a reply, something that we can answer more easily, more readily. And it's funny that this is like this because I teach media training. And what I have to do is help people understand that you get a question, and you don't need to answer the question verbatim. It's not to your advantage. In other words, find a way to answer the question, but answer it in ways that drive your agenda, not the interviewer's agenda in that regard. So, I'm sorry, you had a question?
I just want to comment. I think related to this, I feel like the human brain also doesn't really like uncertainty, and so we like to fill gaps. So I feel like sometimes when we receive information, but there are certain omissions, can be kind of intentional because the human likes to fill up these gaps in however they go.
Do you have a question back?
Yeah. I was just going to add another point about gaps. I just learned a new fact earlier that each of your eyes, there's a blind spot in your eyes, because when the brain fills in the information, the spot is not, you can see it. So
Great points. Well, we have more biases, so I'll run these through quickly. There are a lot. I pared down some more. Another one is confirmation bias, which I think fits into both of your points. You have a way of seeing the world, you want to create order, so you'll always look for those things that help you to affirm what your particular thoughts are in that regard. I also thought the last one was very interesting, insensitivity to sample size, because we've been taught that everything refers to the mean. So when we see a small hospital, for example, the study shows, we think that the boy-girl ratio will always be 50-50, right? In a large hospital, the same. But because the sample size is so small in that rural hospital, you may not have a 50-50 ratio. You may have a 70-30, 90-10 ratio. So sample size matters, but yet when we do sampling, when we look at different types of examples, we assume that they're all on the same plane. They're all like versus like. It's one orange compared to another. And indeed, that isn't always the case.
Jim, isn't this how they
else doesn't get the
Dr. Shereen, excellent point, because this is really marketing too. So if you're interested in doing marketing, this is important too. But you know, it's also important for you if you were to work for the World Bank and do development economics, because you can see how different people see development economics. And the country or the community that you're working with, they may have a very different idea about what the word development and economics mean. And it may be embedded with all kinds of cultural issues where you're coming in with a very different kind of model that you think will generate growth and income. And because of that, you may not be so open to what these other ideas are. So I think it goes back to what Frank Luntz says, open your ears, learn how to use words, and in terms of the rhetoric that you provide to your potential clients, just like political rhetoric, if you're providing rhetoric to your clients, it's important that you think through the kinds of words that you're using to make sure you're on the same wavelength as they are as well too. I thought this was a really interesting bias too. Stroke effect. Has anyone heard of that? Well, stroke effect. This is really interesting because if you were to write the word red in red, no problem, right? We'll read red really quickly. But studies show that if you were to write the word red in blue, we have an aha moment. We get stuck because it's jarring and we are asking our brain to function at two levels. One is the level of 2 plus 2, the thinking fast, but the other is at the level 3. The level 2, which is slow thinking, laborious thinking. And that's because color, determining what is a color, is a much deeper thinking process than simply reading the word red. So, and they have loads of examples like that, but it's actually an interesting dynamic. And the other point to get across here, which opens up scores and scores of studies, is that habit overrides deliberation. In other words, we see the word red, we think red. We see the word blue, we think blue. We see 2 plus 4, 2 plus 2, 4. So we develop these kind of cognitive processes, these habits that shape how we think in that regard. Now we get to thinking fast and slow. How many people have read this book? Oh my gosh, 2. I read it because you sent it to me. All right, man. Must read. Give me your quick synopsis of it.
To my understanding, Kahneman, he developed this, I wouldn't call it theory, but it's in a way to understand different systems of thinking, different modes of thinking. One is that is more slow and rational, and it needs time in order to develop a more accurate response. Whereas there's the fast thinking, which is kind of instinctive. It's something we do all the time, and it's faster and oftentimes irrational. Most of the times irrational, and that what's interesting about it is that it kind of encompasses how we see the world, because oftentimes we do think in system 1, even in other I'm not sure if he mentioned other studies, but there are multiple studies in psychology where they do these experiments and they recognize that even in situations where they should use system 2 or the thinking slow system of thinking, they oftentimes think fast because it's just the easier route, and because we're instinctive problem solvers and we kind of just like it the easy way.
Okay. Well, we've got about 7 or 8 minutes, so I just want to leave you with this experiment gives people. 2 plus 2, 4, right? Now what if I said something like 253 divided by 479? What happens? Right? You feel it, right? Your heart goes up a bit, right? You have difficulty, but what do? We start to figure it out. Well, it kind of sounds like it's F, but with cell phones today, it's not so hard of a thing to do. So, Kahneman is really critical. We talked about that. There are endless debates about whether or not it's hardwired. And I actually asked ChatGPT, I want an illustration. convey this idea of whether or not intellect is hardwired or whether or not, thinking fast, thinking slow, and it was still thinking about it. So that's about the best it came up with, so in that regard. And part of it is all to do with technologies. We know all that, right? We know root lives are faster. There's a compression of time and space in that regard. I mentioned earlier, it's not what people hear. It's what people hear. It's not what people say. Framing matters. Spoke about Frank Luntz. I'm just going to quickly go over some semantics. Frank Luntz was very famous for changing the word of a policy called estate taxes. What he did was, when you hear the word estate taxes, what do you think? Wealthy people, they can afford to pay more taxes, right? They need to pay they can pay more. Well, he did research, and the way he does research is awesome. People, just like you're sitting here, he has people lined up with a little meter, and he has them dial to the left or to the right, in terms of strength, the word, or the lack of strength. And he chooses words based upon that. And guess what he changed the words to? Death taxes. And that helped to move the legislation through. Why? Because when you hear the word death, everyone's affected by death, right? So they're thinking, more taxes on me? No, we oppose it. And he does this again and again and again with policies to try to make them more palatable. I'm going to do that. So one really quick other thing is the power of the narrative. I mentioned Robert Schiller's book early on. We just realized how important stories are. And where do we see that in our daily lives today? TikTok. You go on TikTok and you see endless numbers of TikToks which show you how to best tell your story to get more followers. Stories tell. And what makes a story really powerful? Yes, here. What makes a story powerful?
The way a person says it.
Okay, that's a good point. Okay. What are some other things? Okay.
If it has like a good hook or a good beginning that you want to continue the story.
Okay, what's a good hook? Because that's easy. What's a good hook? Have you seen a good hook lately?
If it's, I think also like about your algorithm. If your like it would be depending on what you want from her, what you would like to hear. So
Okay. So that's good. She's really moving us towards the science of this business as well too. But basically, it's the emotional connection. TikTok videos, why do they connect? They're extremely emotional. They use color, they use video, they use personality, they use voice, and that type of thing. What Robert Schiller says, and what numerous other people have said, he's won a Nobel Prize for economics. He's a professor at Yale. He says that you can't understand the economy today unless you understand the narrative. And that's something that politicians don't necessarily understand. They don't understand how people see the world, use words, and how they construct narratives that fit. And I think you see that most vividly today in the disconnect in this issue about affordability in the U.S., which is really snowballing in terms of political dynamics. That people feel that their lives are more and more, they can't afford to live their lives anymore, their lifestyle is dropping. And again, it's a narrative. So always look for the narrative, or if you want to persuade, always try to think in terms of narrative terms. So I've basically summarized, some of the points I made earlier. I'll summarize. Often, more than not, politicians don't understand markets. Their statements are often vague and contradictory. And that's a problem because markets don't like that, right? Businesses are committing capital for 6 months a year, trillions of dollars of capital. They don't want to have a carpet pulled out from under them, when they go tumbling. Because it's like a super tanker in the ocean. You can't turn a super tanker very quickly. And the same process holds for there. Also consistency. They want consistency. Because they want to be able to look into the future and minimize these kinds of risk, political risk, which they see as manageable risk, as opposed to market risk, other kinds of disasters which could happen, which could affect market prices. So that's a very quick overview of what I want to accomplish today. So let me just go around and ask for some quick takeaways, and I'll start with you, and then you can pass the mic over to your colleagues. What would you, when you walk out of here today, what do you think you learned? What sticks in your mind?
I really learned a lot. I liked the beginning. The video, when we explained about Greenland and everything, I really liked the talk.
Okay. And how would you use anything from today to inform your studies or inform your career?
I liked the books and I liked the biases part.
Okay. Good. Your economics students. So.
But I actually think the part that stood out to me most was the idea of first impressions being very hard to change. I thought that I guess they were more easily changeable than I thought, and I don't know. I found it interesting how first impressions can I guess be like the defining moment of a person if when meeting another one. So I think it's interesting. I'll keep it in mind, and I'll also check out the books that you mentioned. So.
Okay. Well, a caveat, these guys who sell popular books, Malcolm Gladwell, they simplify things. It's not that simple. There's a lot of variants come into play, and always it depends on the circumstances. All things being equal. So, understand that, but realize that they are malleable as well too. Because that's why people vote for one candidate at one time in massive numbers, and then a year later, he's toast. So you quick takeaway.
I actually have a question. I did want to ask, when we were talking about Trump and how his negative rhetoric did impact the market and kind of made it a little bit inconsistent, how would you compare that to Biden, especially towards the end of his administration? Because there had been a bit of inconsistencies, and that kind of made people want to vote for Trump. So.
I think Trump is just a master of the social media. He's a master, they call him the bully pulpit. He's very forceful and strong in his deliverance. And I think Biden, towards the last part of his administration, I think they had a lot of things that they were trying to do. And he was at the point where everything he was involved with was getting more messy. Trump is early in his administration, he could be more emphatic and draw lines and declare things. But after a bit of time, his hands get muddy too, right? And he gets stuck with the mess. And it's harder to have a clear definitive message. Does that give you some insights? Okay.
I thought it was really interesting. I've never come across the term narrative economics, so I'll definitely be reading more on narrative economics. I feel like it's kind of the science of storytelling. So for me, really interesting. I'll be reading the books as well.
Awesome. And I have footnotes in the written text, which have all the references. Right. And your takeaway?
Actually, I have a comment as well. Maybe I think when you had a slide before this, when you said the narrative that you mentioned TikTok.
For me, Trump is a narrative all of himself, just even visually. He's big.
He's always wearing the same thing. He wears a red tie. He's got this orange hair that he's the trademark of, and the skin. And I think this might
explain, in light of what you were saying, this might explain how people have framed him for a strong leader, even though everything he said that Biden wasn't doing, he is now doing today. And the destruction.
Is the clock going down?
Good.
So, I have a different take, and most people disagree with my take on Trump, but I always call it the genius of Trump, because I actually believe that all the books that you referred to and the concepts, I think Trump has taken all of that and he's used it to his advantage, because at the end of the day, why do I call it the genius of Trump? Because I also believe that
Epstein files if they're very redacted like that?
Oh, it's beyond me. That's a question beyond me and beyond the purview. I want to focus more on markets and things, but I think she hit on a great point about markets. My neighbor said to me, well, who cares what Trump says? Because if you look long-term, markets, stocks outperform, they do such and such. True, but markets and investors, it's all about timing, right? So unfortunately, you may pull that money out of the market at a moment, the day that he announces Greenland, and what you thought you had to buy a new house, well, half of it's gone. So that is true, and it's important for investors not to focus on the noise, what they call noise every day, but to look at the long-term performance of these sectors and be aware of how the dynamics, the fundamentals of markets shape market prices and the future prosperity of those companies in your portfolio.
All right, thank you very much, Jim. Thanks for joining us.